You're standing at the edge of a river. It's around 9000 BC. The sun is high, you're thirsty, and technically there is a perfectly good pool of water sitting right there in that hollow log. Except it smells strange. It's slightly fizzy. It's a different color than it was a week ago when you left fruit in it by accident. And something is telling you, some flicker of curiosity older than language, that you should probably drink it anyway. So you do, and about 20 minutes later you feel, against all available context, fantastic. This is not a story about alcoholism. This is not a story about college freshmen or ancient Rome or wine snobs. This is the story of the very first time a human being deliberately drank something fermented, and why that moment might be one of the most consequential accidents in the entire history of our species. Because here's the thing nobody tells you about alcohol. We didn't invent it, we discovered it. And we didn't discover it because we were clever. We discovered it because fruit rots, water sits, grain gets wet, and the universe has been running fermentation experiments since long before there were humans around to notice. The question isn't why humans eventually started drinking. That part practically explains itself. The question is how deep it goes. And the answer, it turns out, goes very, very deep. Let's start with yeast, because yeast is the actual protagonist of this story, and it almost never gets credit. Yeast is a microorganism. It's been on this planet for hundreds of millions of years, and its entire existence basically consists of eating sugar and producing alcohol and carbon dioxide as a byproduct. That's it. That's the whole organism. Yeast found sugar, eats sugar, makes alcohol, dies in its own waste once the alcohol concentration gets high enough. It's a beautiful, tragic little existence, and it happens constantly, everywhere, whether or not anyone is watching. Every piece of fruit that falls off a tree and sits on the ground long enough is fermenting. Every pool of standing water with dissolved sugars in it is fermenting. Every hive of bees that gets wet, every patch of grain that gets rained on, every hollow in a tree where sap collects. Fermentation. The forest floor, for most of human evolutionary history, was essentially a distributed network of extremely low-quality bars, and our primate ancestors were drinking from it for a very long time before they understood what drinking meant. Here's where this gets genuinely interesting. Primates, not just humans, but our evolutionary relatives, have a demonstrated preference for fermented fruit over fresh fruit. Not across the board and not always deliberately. But when given a choice in experimental conditions, many primate species consistently choose slightly fermented fruit over the non-fermented alternative. And the working hypothesis for why is not that monkeys are looking for a good time. It's that fermented fruit in the ancestral environment was a reliable signal of high caloric density. Ripe, slightly fermented fruit is bursting with sugar. For an animal tracking calories in an environment where calories were never guaranteed, that sweet, slightly alcoholic smell was basically the evolutionary equivalent of a neon sign saying, "Eat this, it's good." So the preference for alcohol may not have started as a preference for alcohol at all. It may have started as a preference for ripe, high-calorie food, with the mild intoxication as a rider. A bonus. Something that came along for the trip without anyone asking. Now here's where the timeline gets genuinely humbling. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, have been around for roughly 300,000 years. Our genus, Homo, goes back considerably further, around 2 to 3 million years, and the genetic evidence suggests that the ability to efficiently metabolize ethanol, to process alcohol in the body without being immediately incapacitated, evolved in our ancestors around 10 million years ago. Long before we were human. Long before we were even close to human. The enzyme responsible, a variant of alcohol dehydrogenase called ADH4, mutated in a common ancestor of humans, chimpanzees, and gorillas around the time those lineages were diverging. And the leading hypothesis for why is exactly what you'd expect: the ground-feeding lifestyle. As our ancestors started spending more time on the ground and eating fallen fruit rather than plucking it fresh from trees, the ability to handle fermented food without dying became genuinely useful. We didn't adapt to alcohol. We were already adapted to it before we were us. Sit with that for a moment. The capacity that allows humans to drink wine with dinner, to metabolize a beer without falling over, to process ethanol in the liver with the practiced ease of a system that's been doing this for millions of years. That capacity predates our species by an enormous margin. By the time the first anatomically modern human walked the earth, their body had already been handling dietary alcohol for roughly 10 million years of ancestral practice. The liver knew what to do. The question was just whether anyone would do it on purpose. And at some point, someone did. The oldest direct evidence of deliberate alcohol production, meaning a fermented beverage made intentionally, not just stumbled into, comes from a cave in northern China called Jiahu, dating to around 7000 BC. Archaeologists analyzing the residue inside pottery vessels found traces of a mixed fermented drink: rice, honey, fruit, possibly hawthorn. The signature of deliberate brewing is unmistakable. This wasn't a happy accident with a fallen fruit. Someone gathered ingredients, combined them, stored them, and let them ferment on purpose, 9,000 years ago. That's the confirmed baseline for intentional brewing. But here's the question that should be already forming in your mind. Does that mean it started 9,000 years ago? Or does that just mean that's when we started using pottery that survived long enough for us to find it? Because before pottery, there are no containers. And without containers, there's no chemical residue to analyze. And without chemical residue, there's no archaeological evidence, even if people were brewing in animal stomachs and wooden vessels and gourd bowls for thousands of years before that. The absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. Again, there's a competing theory, and it's one of the more provocative arguments in all of archaeology, called the Drunken Monkey Hypothesis. Actually, that's the popular name. The formal version, developed by biologist Robert Dudley, proposes that the human relationship with alcohol isn't cultural at all in its origins. It's biological. It's written into our evolutionary history by 10 million years of primate adaptation to dietary ethanol. The craving, the reward, the way alcohol activates the dopamine system in a way that feels like something important is happening. That's not a modern bug. That's an ancient feature, repurposed. The same signal that told a tree-climbing primate, "This fruit is ripe and calorie-dense," is the signal that tells a modern human, "This is good, have more." The context changed. The neural wiring didn't. This does not mean addiction is inevitable, or that everyone who drinks is just obeying their evolutionary programming. The modern context, distillation, industrial production, concentrated alcohol in volumes no ancestral forest ever produced, is so far removed from the fermented fruit scenario that drawing direct behavioral conclusions gets complicated very fast. But the underlying biology, the reason alcohol affects us the way it does, the reason it integrates so smoothly into the brain's reward circuits rather than fighting them, that has a 10 million year explanation. Now let's talk about why deliberate brewing starts where it does, because the timing is not an accident. Jiahu, 7000 BC, is right in the middle of what historians call the Neolithic Revolution, the shift from hunter-gatherer societies to settled agricultural ones. And for a long time, the mainstream story was simple. Humans settled down, started farming, and then figured out that grain fermented into something nice. Agriculture first, alcohol second. Then archaeologists started looking more carefully, and the story got messier and considerably more interesting. Because the evidence from multiple sites now suggests the relationship might have been at least partly reversed. Not agriculture causes alcohol, but possibly the desire for fermented beverages was one of the things that motivated the shift to agriculture in the first place. The argument, associated with researchers like Patrick McGovern at the University of Pennsylvania, runs something like this. Hunter-gatherers knew about fermentation. They'd been observing it and occasionally benefiting from it for an extremely long time. When they began to consider settling in one place and cultivating plants deliberately, the ability to produce reliable, reproducible fermented beverages on a large scale may have been a significant part of the appeal. Beer requires grain. Grain requires cultivation. So the desire for beer may have been among the pressures that drove the adoption of grain agriculture. This is sometimes called the beer before bread hypothesis. And while it remains genuinely contested among archaeologists, the evidence it rests on keeps accumulating. Göbekli Tepe, the remarkable ceremonial site in southeastern Turkey dating to around 11,600 years ago, predating any confirmed agricultural settlement in the region, shows clear evidence of large-scale communal feasting. And residue analysis of stone vessels at the site found traces consistent with fermented grain beverages. This is a site where people gathered, built enormous monuments, and apparently brewed something to drink while they did it. Before they were farmers, before they had cities, before they had anything we would recognize as civilization. They had beer. Then they figured out the rest. This might sound like revisionism, but think about it from a motivational standpoint. What compels a hunter-gatherer, a person whose entire way of life is optimized for mobility, for following game and seasonal food sources, for not getting stuck in one place? To stop, to put down roots in a specific location and tend to plants for months at a time. Grain keeps you alive, but grain doesn't compel you in the same way that the prospect of a reliable, communal, consciousness-altering beverage might. Food is survival. A shared drink at the end of a long ritual gathering is something else entirely. And that brings us to the social function, which is the piece of this story that almost always gets overlooked in favor of the biology. Alcohol is a social technology, has been from the beginning. When humans gather and share a fermented drink, several things happen simultaneously. Inhibition drops, conversation flows, emotional barriers lower. The sense of group cohesion strengthens. Modern neuroscience tells us that moderate alcohol consumption triggers the release of endorphins, the same neurochemicals involved in social bonding, in laughter, in the warmth you feel around people you trust. It is, in a very literal sense, a bonding agent, not just metaphorically, chemically. For a species that survived primarily through cooperation, through the ability to coordinate large groups of unrelated individuals in shared tasks, anything that enhanced group cohesion had genuine survival value. A tribe that could bond effectively, that could build and maintain trust across dozens or hundreds of individuals, was a more effective tribe. It could coordinate better hunts. It could resolve internal conflicts before they became fractures. It could absorb and integrate strangers more readily. All of this was life or death for most of human history. Shared ritual consumption of a psychoactive substance is one of the most powerful group bonding mechanisms humans have ever discovered. You only need to look at how universally alcohol appears in ceremonies, weddings, funerals, seasonal rituals, negotiations between rival groups, initiations, harvests, to understand that this is not accidental. The drink is not just refreshment. The drink is infrastructure. The drink is the technology through which trust gets built and maintained at scale. There's also the medical angle, which almost always surprises people. In the ancient world, before germ theory, before water treatment, before any understanding of what pathogens were or how they spread, alcohol was medicine in a way that wasn't superstition. It was practice informed by observation. Alcohol kills bacteria. Beer and wine, even at the relatively low concentrations produced by natural fermentation, are meaningfully safer to drink than standing water in a pre-modern settlement. A stream near a village is collecting runoff from that village's waste. Standing water breeds bacterial contamination. Fermented beverages, even weak ones, have a level of microbial stability that untreated water simply does not. We don't have evidence that ancient people understood this mechanism, but we have overwhelming evidence that they observed the outcome. Drink the water from certain sources, get sick. Drink the fermented grain beverage, don't. The logic doesn't require germ theory. It just requires pattern recognition, and our ancestors were not short of that. Ancient Egypt takes this further than almost anyone. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest medical texts in existence, dating to around 1550 BC, contains hundreds of medical prescriptions. A significant number of them involve wine or beer as a carrier or active ingredient. Not because Egyptian physicians were drinking on the job, but because they understood empirically that fermented beverages had therapeutic properties. They used beer to treat digestive complaints, to clean wounds, to manage pain. They mixed it with herbs and animal products and delivered it as medicine. The delivery mechanism was the drink. Ancient Mesopotamia, Sumer, Babylon left us some of the most detailed records of beer production in the ancient world. The hymn to Ninkasi, a Sumerian poem from around 1800 BC, is simultaneously a prayer to the goddess of beer and a complete brewing recipe. It describes malting barley, making bread, mixing it with water and allowing it to ferment. It is the oldest recipe of any kind that we have, and it is a recipe for beer. Not for bread, not for stew, not for any practical survival food, for fermented grain beverage, and it was sacred enough to be addressed to a goddess. That tells you something about what alcohol meant to these people. This wasn't casual consumption. This was connection to the divine. The intoxication wasn't an unfortunate side effect to be tolerated in pursuit of hydration. It was the point. The loosening of the ordinary mind, the feeling of contact with something larger than yourself, the dissolution of the boundary between the mundane and the transcendent. That was what they were reaching for, and they built a goddess around it. The Greeks had Dionysus. The Norse had mead given by the gods. The Vedic tradition in ancient India had Soma, a sacred ritual drink of uncertain composition but unmistakable psychoactive intent, described in the Rigveda with the kind of awe that people reserve for things that feel genuinely holy. Across ancient cultures that had no contact with each other, that developed independently across thousands of miles and thousands of years, the pattern repeats. Fermented drink. Ritual context, divine connection, sacred status. This is not coincidence. This is the same human need finding the same solution repeatedly. And then, as with smoking, the story takes a familiar and uncomfortable turn. What begins as ritual, controlled, sacred, embedded in ceremony and meaning and social structure, eventually becomes industrial. The timeline is different for different regions, but the shape is the same everywhere. Fermentation technology improves, production scales, access broadens. The drink moves from the ritual context into the tavern, from the sacred to the transactional. And somewhere in that transition, a lot of what gave alcohol its social utility, the controlled setting, the communal context, the shared meaning, gets stripped away, leaving the chemical without the framework. Addiction without ritual, consumption without ceremony. The ancient Sumerians who wrote hymns to Ninkasi were not naive about this, incidentally. Their texts include instructions for drinking in moderation and references to the problems of excess. They knew. They built the warning into the same culture that built the ceremony. The issue isn't that ancient people failed to understand the risks. The issue is that scale changes everything. A sacred drink shared among a village in a seasonal ceremony is one thing. An industrial product distributed through millions of retail outlets optimized for repeat purchase is something so different it barely deserves the same name. A Sumerian priest and a modern beverage company executive both work with fermented grain. Almost nothing else is the same. So when did ancient humans actually start drinking? The honest answer is that we don't know exactly, and the more you look at the evidence, the more you realize the question itself may be slightly wrong. Because the biological relationship between humans and ethanol doesn't have a start date, it evolved. Gradually, over 10 million years of ancestral exposure to naturally fermented food. The shift from passive exposure to active production, from eating fermented fruit off the ground to deliberately brewing a grain beverage in a clay vessel. That's a cultural transition, and the earliest confirmed evidence puts it around 9,000 years ago in China, with every indication that similar things were happening independently elsewhere at roughly the same time, tied to the same Neolithic shift towards settled agriculture. But the drive that made brewing attractive, the biological reward, the social function, the medical utility, the spiritual resonance, all of that is far older. It may be as old as the first upright primate that reached for fallen fruit on the forest floor and found that the slightly funky one made the afternoon feel different. What we know for certain is this. By the time the historical record opens in every civilization we have evidence for, Sumer, Egypt, China, India, Greece, Mesoamerica, they were all already brewing something. The specific ingredients changed, the ceremonies changed, the gods attached to it changed, but the behavior was already ancient by the time anyone thought to write it down. Already woven so deeply into the fabric of what it meant to gather together, to mark important moments, to reach for the sacred, to maintain the social bonds that made large-scale human cooperation possible, that by the time it became history, it had already been prehistory for a very long time. There is something quietly remarkable about that continuity. The same basic chemical reaction, yeast consuming sugar, producing alcohol, that a Sumerian brewer monitored in a clay vessel 9,000 years ago is what happens in every fermentation tank, every winery, every craft brewery operating today. The yeast doesn't know. The yeast has never known. It just keeps doing what it does. And humans, across 10 million years of evolution and 9,000 years of deliberate practice, keep noticing that the result is interesting. Useful occasionally, social almost always, sacred sometimes, dangerous often enough, but never, apparently, something we were willing to stop. Next time you raise a glass at a wedding or a wake or just the end of a long week, you're participating in something that runs unbroken through the entire span of recorded human history and well beyond it. The faces change, the vessels change, the gods change, the drink stays. Some things are just that old.